You wake up in a world where every face around you belongs to your own kind. Every laugh, every argument, every campfire story comes from another human just like you. It feels ordinary, but for most of your species' existence, it wasn't. For thousands of years, you shared this planet with other kinds of humans. They walked different landscapes, they looked different, they thought differently. Yet they made tools, cared for their families, survived brutal winters, and watched the same stars. Then, one by one, they disappeared. Why? That question has become one of the greatest mysteries in all of human evolution. Your ancestors were never alone. Around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, but they were only one branch on a much larger family tree. Europe belonged largely to Neanderthals. Across Asia lived another mysterious group now known as the Denisovans. Earlier humans such as Homo erectus had already spread across much of the Old World, surviving for well over 1,000,000 years before fading from the fossil record. Imagine stepping into that world. A valley beyond the mountains might not simply contain another tribe. It could contain another species of human, not monsters. Not cavemen swinging clubs. People, different people. The story begins long before recorded history, long before agriculture, cities, or even language as you know it. It begins with a family tree that kept branching. Small populations became isolated by mountains, deserts, glaciers, and enormous distances. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these groups slowly evolved in different directions. Evolution is surprisingly slow. No individual suddenly changes into something new. Tiny differences accumulate over countless generations until separate populations become distinct enough to recognize as different human species. This process left behind an astonishing diversity of humans. Neanderthals developed powerful bodies suited to Ice Age Europe. Their wide chests conserved heat. Their large noses warmed freezing air before it reached their lungs. They hunted massive animals in harsh climates that would challenge even modern explorers. Meanwhile, in Africa, Homo sapiens evolved lighter skeletons, longer legs for endurance, and brains capable of extraordinary flexibility. Adaptability became your ancestors' greatest weapon, but anatomy tells only part of the story. Archaeology reveals something far more fascinating. At sites like Blombos Cave, archaeologists discovered engraved pieces of ochre dating back roughly 75,000 years. These weren't practical tools. They were deliberate patterns carved into stone, suggesting symbolic thought. Nearby, carefully crafted shell beads hint that your ancestors decorated themselves and perhaps communicated identity through ornament. Far away in Europe, deep inside Chauvet Cave, magnificent paintings of horses, lions, rhinoceroses, and mammoths cover limestone walls with remarkable skill. Whether created by Homo sapiens alone or influenced by earlier traditions remains debated, but they reveal minds capable of imagination that still feels familiar today. Then came an astonishing discovery. In 2010, geneticists led by Svante Pääbo extracted ancient DNA from a tiny finger bone found inside Denisova Cave. The bone belonged to neither a Neanderthal nor a modern human. It belonged to an entirely unknown population, the Denisovans. Before that single fragment, nobody even knew they had existed. A child no bigger than your thumb had rewritten human history. The deeper scientists looked, the stranger the picture became. This wasn't a story of one successful species replacing primitive failures. It was a world filled with multiple intelligent human groups, sometimes separated by thousands of kilometers, sometimes living almost next door to each other. And eventually, their paths crossed. They didn't meet only in battle. For decades, that was the popular image. Modern humans marched out of Africa, overwhelmed every other human species, and claimed the planet through superior intelligence alone. It made for a simple story. Reality is far more complicated. Your DNA carries the evidence. If your ancestry traces largely outside Africa, about 1 to 2% of your genome comes from Neanderthals. That means somewhere around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, your ancestors met Neanderthals not only as rivals, but as partners. They had children together, and those children survived long enough to pass their genes through thousands of generations. Today, pieces of Neanderthal DNA still influence your immune system, your skin, your metabolism, and even how your body responds to certain diseases. Some populations in Oceania carry an even larger legacy. Many people from regions such as Papua New Guinea inherit up to 5% of their DNA from Denisovan ancestors. A mysterious human species, known only from a handful of bones, still lives on inside millions of people. The family tree was never neat. It was a web. This discovery transformed the field of paleoanthropology, the study of ancient humans through fossils, archaeology, and genetics. Instead of isolated branches that never touched, scientists now see repeated encounters, migrations, and exchanges over tens of thousands of years. One remarkable fossil made that reality impossible to ignore. Inside Denisova Cave, researchers found the remains of a teenage girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. She wasn't the distant descendant of mixed populations. She was a first-generation child with parents from two different human groups. That single individual tells an extraordinary story. These encounters were not incredibly rare accidents. They happened often enough that different human populations recognized one another as potential mates. Think about what that means. You could have stood around a campfire and spoken to someone who looked noticeably different from you, came from another human lineage, yet was close enough to become family. The mystery suddenly becomes even deeper. If humans could live together, if they could have children together, why did every other human species disappear? One explanation points toward climate. During the last ice age, temperatures swung dramatically. Vast grasslands expanded and vanished. Forests advanced before retreating again. Rivers changed course. Entire ecosystems transformed over only a few thousand years. A brief moment in evolutionary time. Large mammals disappeared from many regions. Prey became unpredictable. Food sources shifted. For specialized hunters like many Neanderthal groups, these rapid environmental changes may have created immense pressure. Archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthals often hunted large animals at close range. Broken bones found at sites across Europe reveal injuries similar to those suffered by modern rodeo riders, implying dangerous encounters with powerful prey. When those animals became scarce, survival grew harder. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens displayed remarkable flexibility. Research by Richard B. Lee on the Juhwansi people of southern Africa demonstrated how hunter-gatherers could thrive by combining many different food sources rather than depending on only one. While no modern group perfectly represents prehistoric life, such studies help archaeologists understand how flexible foraging strategies can improve survival in unpredictable environments. Your ancestors ate fish. They gathered shellfish, they trapped rabbits, they collected seeds, they harvested roots. They adapted. Adaptability may have mattered more than strength, but climate alone cannot explain everything. Neanderthals had already survived multiple ice age cycles before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. They were experienced survivors. Cold itself was nothing new. Something else changed. Many researchers now suspect that population size played a crucial role. Imagine two neighboring groups. One numbers perhaps 20,000 individuals scattered across a continent. The other numbers several 100,000, connected through larger social networks stretching over enormous distances. Which population recovers more easily after disease? Which replaces lost knowledge more quickly? Which finds new mates without risking inbreeding? Larger networks create resilience. Ideas spread farther. If one group invents a better spear point or discovers a new food source, neighboring communities can learn it within generations. Small, isolated populations rarely have that advantage. Research by anthropologist Joseph Henrich argues that larger interconnected populations preserve complex knowledge more effectively than tiny isolated groups. Skills that seem permanent can disappear surprisingly quickly when too few people remain to teach the next generation. Knowledge itself became a survival tool, not just intelligence, shared intelligence. And perhaps that was the quiet advantage that ultimately reshaped the world. Another possibility is disease. Today, when you hear the word pandemic, you imagine airplanes, crowded cities, and global travel. But diseases do not need airports to spread. They need contact. When previously separated human populations met, they almost certainly exchanged more than ideas and genes. They exchanged pathogens. Unfortunately, diseases leave very little trace in the archaeological record. Viruses rarely fossilize, and bacteria disappear long before bones become stone. That makes this hypothesis incredibly difficult to test. Still, modern history offers striking parallels. When Europeans reached the Americas, diseases devastated indigenous populations that had never encountered them before. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread faster than armies ever could. Could something similar have happened between ancient human groups? Scientists don't know. It remains one of the many unanswered questions that make this period so fascinating. Then there is technology. For generations, Neanderthals were portrayed as unimaginative beings who barely changed over hundreds of thousands of years. That picture has largely collapsed. Archaeologists have discovered evidence that Neanderthals made sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, processed animal hides, produced adhesives by carefully heating birch bark, and may even have created ornaments and symbolic objects. Some sites even suggest they collected feathers from birds, not for food, but perhaps for decoration. That sounds surprisingly familiar. In fact, the more discoveries emerge, the narrower the gap between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens appears. So perhaps technology alone wasn't the deciding factor either. Language is another enduring mystery. Your ability to speak feels effortless. Yet speech depends on an extraordinary combination of anatomy, brain organization, hearing, breathing, and social learning. Did Neanderthals tell stories? Did Denisovans sing to their children? Did they have names? No recording survives. No written language existed. Only clues remain. One important clue comes from the hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that helps support the muscles involved in speech. Neanderthal hyoid bones closely resemble those of modern humans, suggesting they possessed the physical equipment necessary for complex vocal communication. Genetics provides another piece of the puzzle. A gene known as FOXP2, often called a language-related gene because it helps coordinate the fine movements required for speech, appears in both modern humans and Neanderthals in a very similar form. That doesn't prove they spoke exactly like you, but it makes the old image of silent, grunting cavemen increasingly unlikely. Imagine walking through a forest 50,000 years ago. Ahead, smoke rises between the trees. You approach carefully. The voices you hear are human. Almost. The words sound unfamiliar. The rhythm is different. The faces around the fire look broader, stronger, perhaps with heavier brows and larger noses. Children laugh. Adults prepare food. Someone points toward the hunt tomorrow. For a brief moment, you are looking at another version of humanity. Not your ancestors, your cousins. That image is difficult to forget because it forces a profound realization. Humanity was never destined to be a single species. It only became one. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not why other humans disappeared. Perhaps it is why your lineage remained. Luck may have played a larger role than we like to admit. A volcanic eruption, a sequence of unusually harsh winters, a disease outbreak, one failed hunting season, a few generations with too few children. Evolution often turns on events that seem insignificant at the time. Entire branches of the human family tree may have vanished because of a string of bad years. Meanwhile, another population happened to survive. Success in evolution is rarely about perfection. It is about persistence. That lesson appears again and again throughout nature. Species that adapt to changing conditions tend to endure. Those that cannot often disappear, regardless of how successful they once were. Your ancestors were remarkably flexible. They entered deserts. They crossed mountains. They followed coastlines. Eventually, they reached Australia, Europe, Siberia, and much later, the Americas. Every new landscape demanded new solutions. Every challenge rewarded curiosity. That willingness to experiment, to try different tools, different foods, different social connections, may have mattered more than being stronger or smarter. It may simply have made your ancestors better at surviving uncertainty. Modern genetics continues to surprise researchers almost every year. Ancient DNA techniques pioneered by Svante Pääbo and many colleagues have transformed fragments of bone into windows onto forgotten worlds. Fossils once considered ordinary are now yielding entirely new stories as laboratory methods become more sensitive. The next great discovery may already be waiting inside a museum drawer or buried beneath a layer of ancient sediment. Perhaps another human species remains undiscovered. Perhaps another chapter of your own ancestry has yet to be revealed. That possibility is astonishing, because despite centuries of science, humanity still doesn't fully understand humanity. You are the last surviving human species, but you are not the only one that ever existed. Every heartbeat, every conversation, every family gathering carries the legacy of a much larger human story. A story of cousins who explored different paths before history narrowed them into silence. You woke up believing humanity had always been alone. Now you know that for most of your evolutionary journey, it wasn't. And perhaps the greatest mystery of human evolution isn't why the others disappeared. It's how incredibly close they still are, living on in your DNA, your biology, and in the unanswered questions that continue to shape what it means to be human.